Hello, my name is Mark Corbett, and I serve as the pastor of Seventh Baptist Church. I'm sitting here in my church office. I was hoping I could leave the blinds open behind me so you could have a nice view out there, but the light was so bright that you wouldn't be able to see me very well on the camera if I did that. And apologize, I don't have anything nice for you to look at on the wall. I do have some nice bookshelves over here, but those won't be in view while I'm talking. So I'm going to be sharing with you this morning about a topic that touches a lot of people these days. It's the topic of some of the reasons that some people who had a evangelical faith, or certainly they sincerely professed to have an evangelical faith, and their friends and people who knew them well thought that they did, have lost their faith. And that's a tough topic, and it's an important topic. And I'm going to see if I can do this without my glasses, since it kind of creates a big glare in the picture there. Anyways, before we get into this topic, I'd like to say a prayer. Heavenly Father, I pray that you will be with me as I share some thoughts, and I pray that you will be with those who are watching and listening to this, and that you will use this video for your good purposes, for your glory, and I ask this in Jesus' name, amen. So what specifically prompted me to make this video and to talk with you is that earlier this month, Rhett and Link shared their deconstruction story. Now, you may be wondering, who are Rhett and Link? Well, they call themselves entertainers in terms of what they do for a living. So they produce entertainment on the internet for people to watch. Now, I have not watched their entertaining videos, but apparently I've read a number of people who have, and what they say is that their videos are mostly kind of good, clean, kind of goofy, fun, and humor that a lot of families enjoy, and specifically it includes a lot of Christian families enjoy the type of material they put out there. Their material is not explicitly, it's not Christian. It doesn't talk about the Bible or the gospel, but it has been friendly in terms of being clean, and of course that's not a coincidence, because they come from a background where they actually began to do this type of thing while they were in Christian ministry, on staff with a campus ministry called Crew Now. So Rhett and Link are entertainers. You could also say that they are professional YouTubers, and they are very successful professional YouTubers. A CNBC article that I read ranked them as the 4th highest paid YouTubers of 2019. Now, you may not have realized that you can make a living off of YouTube and making other material on the internet, but you can through advertising and sponsors and methods like that. And according to this article, not only are they making a living, they're making a very good living off of it. In 2019, they estimated that they drew in $17.5 million. And so they have a big following. Like, one of their main YouTube channels, I think, has like 16 million followers, and they have multiple channels, and it's not just on YouTube. They're on other internet venues also. They have podcasts and things like that. Now, since I haven't watched their entertainment stuff, you might wonder how I got interested in this. Well, I heard about their deconstruction story, and because I was preparing for a sermon on the importance of defending and conforming the gospel around the same time that their deconstruction story came out, I decided to watch it. And when I watched their story, I realized that my story, the story of my life, has a lot in common with Rhett and Link's story. So these are some of the things that we have in common. And excuse me, I'm going to need to put these back on to read my notes here, and which hopefully will be appearing on the screen after I edit them in. So anyways, these are some of the things that we have in common. They, and also I myself, we all grew up as deeply committed and active evangelical Christians from elementary school on. And then all three of us majored in engineering at the same university, at North Carolina State University. Now, I'm a few years older than them. I think maybe around 10 or 12 years older than them. So our time at university did not overlap, and I never met them in person. But we both studied engineering at the same school. All three of us, while we were at NC State, were active, very active, in campus ministry during our college years. And then all three of us, after we finished college, worked in engineering fields for several years after college. In my case, I went into, I had been in Navy ROTC, and I became an officer in the Navy, and I served in the engineering department on nuclear submarines for 5 years. And they also worked in engineering for several years. And then all three of us left the engineering field we were in, which was secure, good jobs. We left it in order to pursue ministry. And then also all three of us are very interested in the relationship between science and faith. Now, as important as our similarities are, the differences in our story, I think, are even more important. Their Christian faith grew weaker over time due to evidence they saw, books that they read, things that they thought about, until they reached the point where, according to their own testimony, they are not Christians now. They have left the evangelical Christian faith, and really any type of Christian faith. But my experience has been the opposite of that. My faith has grown stronger over time due to evidence that I've seen, books that I've read, things that I've experienced and thought about. And so I am still a deeply committed and active evangelical Christian. So I said that they shared their deconstruction story. What is a deconstruction story? Well, in their case, and this is true for a number of deconstruction stories, you could just say that it's the story of how they lost their faith, and specifically in their case, how they lost their evangelical faith. But to understand what's meant more specifically by a deconstruction story, it might help if we think of our system of beliefs as a wall, a big, massive wall, or maybe a series of walls, making like a big building or a castle or something like that, consisting of stones. And the stones are all put together into a system of belief, but the stones are not all the same size, and they're not all equally important. And the stones represent individual beliefs we have. For instance, a really big stone for Christians would be belief in the Trinity. Another stone for Christians might be that the Bible is true. That's a big one for me. Jesus died for my sins. That's a real basic Christian belief. But then also, there's other types of stones that aren't the beliefs themselves, but they are reasons that we believe things. So some of these reasons are kind of, and different people have different types of reasons, even if they have the same beliefs. So for some people, there might be academic and technical type of reasons that are important to them, like manuscript evidence that the Bible we have is today, when we read a translation of the Bible in English, that is an accurate representation of what was originally written in the case of the New Testament approximately 2,000 years ago. And then personal experiences could be some of the reasons they have to believe. And I'll mention that near the end. It'll probably be, I think this video is going to end up being in 2 parts, so it will probably be in part 2. are trusted sources. So one reason that people believe things is because they learn them from people that they trust. And that might be people they know personally, like their mom and dad or their grandparents, people like pastors and Sunday school teachers, or if you go on to college, it could be professors, it could be people you don't know personally, but you trust them, and through video or TV or books that they've written, because of their life and what you know about them and the way they speak, it just feels like what they're saying is true. And so you don't have to nail down every detail and research every detail yourself, because you trust them. So that could be part of the reason. Now, a system of belief like Christianity is a whole world view. It's a big system of belief, even though there are some very fundamental, simple basics, like the ones I mentioned, the Trinity and the Bible is true, Jesus died for my sins, things like that. But it could have many, many thousands of, in this analogy we're using, many, many thousands of stones in it, of different size, and the way it's put together isn't going to be exactly identical for any two people, even if the fundamentals of the faith are the same. Now let's talk about what happens with deconstruction. So in order to do this, let's zoom in on one part of this wall as an example. And of course, this is an oversimplification. And by the way, I want to mention, I'm going to be representing Rhett and Link's deconstruction story here, but you can find it yourself and hear it in their own words. They did 2 videos. Rhett did one, Link did one. I think they're each a little over an hour and a half long. If you Google their names in deconstruction, you'll find it in a second on YouTube. But anyways, this is a very simple way to represent what happened when they talk about their faith deconstructing. So here's a piece of their belief system, and we can think that one piece of their belief system, and they testify to this early on. I think they themselves, and certainly a lot of their friends and a lot of the people around them, believed in young earth creationism. So based on the interpretation of the Bible that they and these other people had at this time, they believed that the earth was only maybe 6,000 to 10,000 years old. In fact, the whole universe would be about that age, and that God created it all very recently in history. So now again, for some people, they might believe this, and it's a very tiny part of their belief system. For other people, it might be a pretty big rock in their wall. It might be pretty important to them. But what happens in their case is they found some scientific evidence that caused them to doubt that this is true. And it caused them to think that the earth is really a lot older than that. Maybe it's 4 billion years old, approximately. And so now, if this rock gets a big crack in it, or even if the rock kind of crumbles away, it's just one piece in the wall. So their whole evangelical faith isn't going to collapse because of that. And in fact, this happened with them. They stopped believing in young earth creationism, and it did not cause their faith to crumble at that time. It was replaced with what a lot of people call basically old earth creationism. And there's a lot of variations on the details, but they still believe that God created the earth. But they believe, old earth creationists believe that the 6 days in Genesis 1, most of them would believe that there's different ways they explain that, but a lot of them would think that those days were symbolic days, that they were not literal 24-hour periods, that they represented something like epochs or long periods of time where God was creating. And interestingly, this is something that I also share with Rhett and Link. I used to be pretty certain that young earth creationism was correct. Now, I never felt that it was something that was important enough to fight over or to exclude people from a church over or anything like that. But I did used to think that young earth creationism was probably the correct view. And like Rhett and Link, I eventually saw so much scientific evidence that to me, in my evaluation, points towards an old earth. I went back and I looked at the Bible again, and I thought, I think that those initial passages may have been using some symbolic language. And so this process of deconstruction is sometimes followed by reconstruction, and now there's a new rock there. And so the wall seems to be fine. Now, a more fundamental rock, a more important, and if this was drawn to scale, the bare fact of creation, the idea that God created everything, is a very fundamental belief of Christianity. I really don't think somebody could really be a Christian if they don't agree with the basic idea that somehow, at some point in history, God created everything. And so there's this more foundational belief of creationism. And Rhett and Link started having some cracks in that rock, which is a lot bigger deal. And this came partly through them reading a book. If I remember correctly, it was a book by Francis Collins called The Language of God, in which he presents evidence for evolution. Now, in his case, he believes in theistic evolution. So, again, this is very simplified, but and there might be variations on it. But basically, theistic evolution says that the scientists are right, that the way that we got here, and giraffes got here, and hummingbirds got here, was a natural process based on the forces that scientists can see and study and measure, and random events working together, random variation and selection of the fittest, and that resulted in us being here one day. And the problem with theistic evolution is, well, the biggest problem according to me, and I'm going to share some reasons I think this in a little bit, the biggest problem is that it's not true. But in terms of this, how it affects your system of faith, is that if you believe the scientists are correct, and there's really, you can put theistic in front and say God did it, by which you mean that God set up the process, God made the natural laws, God arranged the circumstances so that evolution could occur. But really, from the science point of view, God is superfluous. You could have the evolution without him as far as the evidence that can be seen by science. And that makes it very easy to discard God from the process altogether. And then eventually you get to the point that you just believe in plain old evolution, molecules to man evolution, not ruling out the possibility that God set up the initial conditions or something, but he's really not needed in the story of how we got here at all. And then, of course, if you believe in evolution, you still believe in an old earth, but the creation part becomes very questionable or just goes away. You believe the earth is old, but you don't need to believe anymore that God created it. That tends to go along. It is a separate issue, but it's connected in many ways, and it was connected for them. And so more and more pieces of your wall are starting to go away here. And then they started to have doubts about the truthfulness and reliability of some of the Old Testament accounts and some of the Old Testament stories. And I'm not going to go into the details on that. We just don't have time to look at everything in detail. And there were some other issues. And again, they have a whole 90-minute videos. So this is a very quick summary. One of the things, for instance, that bothered them a lot was hell. It just seemed to them extraordinarily unjust and cruel that God would torment forever and ever for billions of years and just keep going, and more billions of years and just keep going. The majority of mankind, it seems like, who have not accepted Jesus Christ as their Savior before they die. And so that bothered them. And then also they started having questions about the reliability of the New Testament, prompted partly by reading a book by Bart Ehrman, but even their 90-minute segments were summaries of a process that took place over quite a few years in their life. So this is a simplification of a simplification, but I think it does give the big picture of what happened, and in a very simple way, how they deconstructed, how they lost their evangelical faith. And by the way, one of the reasons I'm concerned about this is that this is not just Rhett and Link's story. There have been quite a few people who have given a similar story of deconstruction out of an evangelical faith, and they often mention the same issues. I've read quite a few of these, and they often mention science, by which I'm pretty sure they always mean, when they say science, the main thing they mean, the big thing they mean is evolution as opposed to creation. And they often mention the issue of hell. They mention this repeatedly. So now they have all of these blocks either severely damaged or missing in their wall. And then, of course, eventually what happens is the wall crumbles, and they no longer consider themselves to be evangelical Christians. In fact, they don't consider themselves really to be Christians at all. Rhett says that he is a hopeful agnostic. He doesn't know if there's a God, but he hopes that there is, and if there is a God, he hopes that he's good and nice, and that things will work out well with that God. Link sounded like he wasn't quite as optimistic. He said he was an agnostic that wanted to be hopeful, which to me makes it sound like he isn't very hopeful right now. So if you take enough pieces out, if enough pieces get damaged, then the basic belief system, in this case evangelical Christianity, can collapse. And that is what happened with them, and it's happened with other people as well. And then they are sharing this on YouTube. Hundreds of thousands of people are watching and listening to what it appears, based on the number of views. And it's not just on YouTube, because they also shared the same talk on some podcasts. So you have to look at the number of views at YouTube and then know that it's a lot higher than that, because some people prefer to listen to this on podcasts. So they are influencing a lot of people possibly to go down the same path they've gone down, and that concerns me. So what I want to do next is I want to examine some of the stones, some of the evidence, some of the reasons. I want to get into some details here, and I want to begin by talking about creation and science. That's one that Rhett spoke about quite a bit, in quite a bit of detail and length. And so I'm going to spend some time on it too. It also happens to be an area that I've spent a lot of time reading about and studying and thinking about. And it's probably not surprising, because we're both from an engineering background, and engineers are not scientists, but we're very science-minded. We study things like chemistry and physics and lots of math, and so we're very science-minded, and so it's not surprising that the science side of it would be important to us. It was for them, and it was for me. And then I want to talk about their concern about hell, and then I'm going to talk about the resurrection of Jesus. This is some of the things I want to talk about coming up. So let's begin with talking about creation and science. And what I want to do first is I want to give a positive case, a very short summary of a positive case that science actually supports belief that God created everything. And so we both I see the challenge from evolution, and Rhett and Link see the challenge from evolution, but we took different paths after we saw this challenge. And they took a path where they looked at theistic evolution, and that is the belief that the scientists are right in terms of the natural processes being what caused life to appear and life to fill up the earth and all the different types of life. But the theistic part means that a person who's a theistic evolutionist believes that somehow invisibly behind the scenes or before it all started, God was involved. But then they went on to just plain evolution Well, they're not saying for sure that there isn't a God involved. They're just saying that um, they can't know that God created everything at this point, and of course that contributed to their faith ending up collapsing in rubble. Well, I took a very different path. Well, it's similar in some ways, but the differences are much more important, I think, than the similarities. So, Mark, that's me. I looked at intelligent design material. So there's a scientific theory and a scientific viewpoint called intelligent design, and basically what it says is based on the type of evidence that scientists look at and the type of reasoning that scientists use, it produces very strong evidence that the universe we live in and living creatures, including us ourselves, that the best explanation for how we got here is that there was a great, powerful, super intelligent designer. Now, just from the point of view of science, that intelligent designer cannot be identified. In theory, it could have been something weird like a space alien that existed before the universe existed or something. But the majority of people who are promoting intelligent design believe that the great, mighty, powerful, super wise, intelligent designer is the God of the Christian Bible. And of course, that's also what I believe. And so as I studied this material, it actually strengthened my faith. My faith in creation, that God created everything and that God is great and he is so wise and he is so powerful. And so my faith got stronger. It's like my rock of belief that represents creation, it's like it got thicker and stronger and bigger as I studied the scientific side of this issue. And so what I want to do next is I want to share evidence, the positive case for intelligent design, for creation, and I'm going to briefly look at some evidence from physics and then briefly look at some evidence from biology. And then I want to discuss the evidence that Rhett shared that I remember what he focused on the most was one particular piece of evidence that, if I remember correctly, he read in the book, The Language of God. I haven't read that book, but I have read about fused chromosome. I know what the issue is. That I'm sure that there was a lot of other evidence, but this piece seemed to be kind of like a smoking gun, proving that evolution must be the way that it happened. And so I do want to look at that particular piece of evidence that he brought up. And because of time and also just the practicalities of making this video, I'm going to be limited in how much detail I can go into. So along the way, I'm going to point you to some resources so that if you want to study this stuff in more depth, you certainly can. So I want to begin by looking at the evidence from physics. And this is can be described as the fine-tuning of the properties of the universe. And the best way to understand what is meant by this is by looking at a specific example. So let's talk about gravity. So we all know what gravity is. It's the force of nature that makes things fall to the earth. Of course, there's a lot more to it than that, but that's basically true, that gravity does that. There's an equation for gravity. Now, I'm going to put this equation up here, but don't panic. It's okay if you do not understand this equation. You do not actually have to understand the equation in order to understand the point that I'm going to make, but having the equation up will help me make the point. You'll see. So here's the equation. F stands for the force of gravity. And M1 and M2 are two objects that each have mass. For instance, it could be your body has a certain amount of mass, and the planet Earth has a certain amount of mass. And and then the R down at the bottom, R squared, the R is the distance between the two bodies. Now, it can get a little bit complicated when you're standing on the Earth. You have to do the distance between your body and the effective, like the rated center of the Earth, but we're not going to get into all those details. But then there's something else in this formula that's very important, and it's this G. And the M1 can change, the M2 can change, the R can change, but the G never changes. The G is what is called the gravitational constant. And scientists know it's a number with units, and scientists know what this number is. So do engineers and anybody who's interested in looking it up. It has been measured and verified. And like other physical constants, the reason it's called a constant is that it never changes. And as far as we can tell, and this is a really fundamental belief of science, and it's one that I think is almost just about as certain as you can get that it's true, is that the gravitational constant is the same everywhere in our universe, and it has been the same ever since the universe began. And scientists looking at distant galaxies and looking at planets and everywhere, this gravitational constant is the same. Now, the force of gravity between any two objects will change depending on how big the objects are and how far apart they are. But this constant is the same. Now, so you can think of this constant as basically as the strength of gravity. Now, a question is, what if it had been different? And this is another important thing about these physical constants. As far as physicists, theoretical physicists, and people who study this stuff, cosmologists, as far as they can tell, there is no known reason that gravity had to be this value. Maybe one day we'll find out that there was a reason, that some other law of physics that forced it to be this value. But as far as we can tell today, there is no known reason that it couldn't have been a different number. And in fact, there are 4 fundamental forces in nature, and we're going to talk about the other 3 in a minute. And the other 3 are vastly different numbers from this one. But as far as we can tell, gravity could have been the same as any of those other numbers, or could have been a value anywhere between this number and any of the other numbers. So what if it had been different? Well, scientists have studied this, and cosmologists have studied it, and I've read some books that talk about this. Might talk about these books some more in a minute. One of these books is this book, Just 6 Numbers by Martin Rees. Another one is this book, The Goldilocks Dilemma by Paul Davies. These guys are really smart when it comes to stuff like physics and cosmology. They're not, neither of these are evangelical Christians. In fact, I don't think either of these are Christians at all. But they've looked at this issue of fine-tuning, and they've said this is a real thing. And what it means is that if gravity had been just a little bit different, just a little bit higher, stronger, or just a little bit weaker, that we could not exist, that the universe either would have expanded so quickly that no stars would form, or it would have collapsed back on itself so quickly that there wouldn't have been time for any life to form. Any stars that did form, either the stars would not have been able to form if gravity was too weak, or if it had formed, they might have burned up very quickly. And so gravity has to be very close to this exact value for the universe to allow life like us to exist. And as far as we know, no type of life could exist in a universe where there were no stars and the whole thing collapsed on itself and blew up, or all there was hydrogen and helium particles floating in space. And now let's think about how gravity compares to the other fundamental forces of nature. Now, I use gravity as an example because that's the one that we're most familiar with. There's this force called the weak nuclear force, but compared to gravity, it's not weak. It is 10 to the 25th times stronger than gravity. So it has a constant, but its constant is 10 to the 25 times bigger than the constant for gravity. And that is a 1 with 25 zeros after it. So a billion is a 1 with 9 zeros after it. A trillion is a 1 with 12 zeros after it. A quadrillion is a 1 with 15 zeros after it. So this number is mind-blowingly large. But if gravity had been just a little bit different, like 3 or 4 times stronger, or 3 or 4 times weaker, never mind 10 times stronger, 1,000 or 1,000,000,000 times stronger, none of us would be here. But as far as the physicists know, it could have been the same value as the weak nuclear force, in which case there would be no universe, there would be no stars, and there would be no me and you. But it turns out that the weak nuclear force also has to be very close to the value it actually is. The electromagnetic force, which is 10 to the 36th times the value of gravity, has to be very close to the value it has. And the strong nuclear force, which is approximately 10 to the 38th times stronger than gravity, has to be very close to the value it has, or we couldn't exist. And the details get very complicated. And basically, if these forces were different, again, stars might not be able to form, they might not exist, and also we might not have chemistry. We might not have, and when I say we might not have chemistry, I'm not talking about you might not have a chemistry class or a chemistry lab. I'm saying there might not be any chemicals. There might not be any atoms. You might have, or you might have, if the numbers were changed a little bit, you might have some atoms, but maybe all you would have is hydrogen and helium. And to have life, you need a lot of different types of atoms, or you can't have complex life of any kind. And so all of these numbers have to be very close to their exact values, but they could have been vastly different. And so it appears that these numbers were designed to allow us to be here. Now, excuse me. Let me get a sip of water. I get excited about this. To me, it's very exciting stuff. Now, in addition to the strengths of the 4 fundamental forces being fine-tuned, physicists have identified other basic properties of the universe that are also fine-tuned to allow life. I think there's maybe about 20 or so. And there are things like the mass of the electron compared to the mass of the proton, and other very, very basic stuff that you don't think about every day. But if it hadn't been exactly the way it actually is, we couldn't be here. There wouldn't be stars, there wouldn't be planets, there wouldn't be atoms, and there certainly wouldn't be hummingbirds and dolphins and you and I living in this universe. Now, I'm going to put, hopefully showing up here on the screen, if I can get that to work, and also down in the notes underneath this YouTube video, a link to a 6-minute video on this topic. It's an animated video. They do a really good job of explaining it, probably maybe better than I've just done. Even if the numbers, I can't verify their numbers independently, but their numbers don't have to be precisely correct for the basic point that the universe we live in is extremely fine-tuned, designed with very, very incredible tolerances in order to allow us to be here. So one of the first scientists who noticed this fine-tuning things was a guy named Fred Hoyle. He was really smart. He figured out, one of the things he figured out is how stars work on the inside when it comes to producing elements. So stars have nuclear fusion, and they turn hydrogen atoms into helium, and hydrogen and helium into bigger atoms. And this is necessary because they end up producing the things that make planets and the things that make us, things like carbon and oxygen and iron. And but he noticed that in order for stars to produce carbon, there would have to be something called a nuclear resonance of carbon, would have to have a very precise value or it just wouldn't work. So he said it must have that value, but nobody knew about this value at that time. But then later, scientists found out that he was right, that there was this thing called a nuclear resonance that allowed stars to form carbon. And this was one of the early examples of fine-tuning. So Fred Hoyle, he said this. He said, a common sense interpretation of the facts, and by the facts, he's talking about the types of things I've been talking about, the fine-tuning of these physical constants and other facts in biology and chemistry that we don't have time to look at. A common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect, and again, Science by itself doesn't tell us who the super intellect is. I believe the super intellect is our Lord Jesus Christ, the God of the Bible, the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. He says a super intellect has monkeyed with physics. That's the evidence that we've been talking about, as well as with chemistry. We're not going to have time to talk about some of the amazing things about how chemistry is fine-tuned, like the properties of water, as well as with chemistry and biology. We're going to look at that next. And that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. In other words, nothing could have gotten this way by chance or by random. Some intelligent being had to make it this way on purpose. It's just no way this could be a coincidence. And he says the numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. Now, I already mentioned these two books, The Goldilocks Enigma by Paul Davies. The idea of Goldilocks is that all of these values in physics, all of these things, it's like Goldilocks. It's like some of the soup was too hot and some of the soup was too cold, but then the soup in the middle was just right. And we live in a universe where these physical constants have numbers that are just right, but like to 1 part in a trillion. They are exactly, super exactly just right to allow us to live. And again, this is not a guy who's trying to prove that evangelical Christianity is true. I don't think he's even a Christian, okay? But he says fine-tuning is a real thing. We can't ignore it. We can't pretend it doesn't exist. And then this other book by this guy, Martin Rees, just 6 numbers, and he's giving 6 examples of these types of numbers, that, including some of the same constants I mentioned to you and some other ones as well, that he says are incredibly fine-tuned for us to be able to exist. And so because these guys, and this is really, I think this is pretty widely accepted in the world of physics and cosmology, that the universe is very wide, very finely tuned. And so you might wonder, well, how come all of these guys don't, get down on their knees and start worshiping Jesus? And I personally think they should, and I do. I mean, I literally, sometimes when I'm studying this, I'll just stop and either sitting in my seat or sometimes just get down on my knees and worship him, because I'm like, God, you're so good, you're so wise, you're so powerful. Thank you for making this wonderful universe that we live in. But you might wonder, what explanation do these other guys who don't worship God, who don't come to the conclusion that God must have created everything, what explanation do they give? Well, one explanation that you've probably heard about, the one that's most popular today, is called the multiverse. And the idea is that, sure, our universe is very special, but maybe there are billions and trillions, and maybe there's almost, practically speaking, or maybe literally, an infinite number of other universes. So when you have that many universes, one of them or some of them are going to turn out to have the right values to allow life. Now, philosophically, theoretically, that could be true. But one thing you need to know about this theory is there is no scientific evidence that the multiverse actually exists. There's no observable evidence, nothing that can be measured, nothing that can be seen. It is it requires a type of faith. Really, I feel like it's different from my faith. It's kind of like a blind faith that doesn't have evidence, just to say, we know the universe is fine-tuned, we don't want to believe God did it, so here's a possible explanation. Now, science cannot prove that God did it either, but there are other types of evidence, like the resurrection of Jesus Christ, that I think shows that that God creating it is a much better explanation than the multiverse creating it. The other thing is that it's not so clear that even scientifically the multiverse is a good explanation, because some people have made some pretty good arguments that for the multiverse to produce universes like ours, there would have to be a mechanism in it, and that mechanism itself would have to be fine-tuned. And I haven't studied that argument in depth, but if it was true, then the multiverse wouldn't actually explain away God, it would just move the problem back one step. So I don't believe the multiverse explains this problem. I think it's that God created, and that explains the fine-tuning. Now let's shift gears and look at evidence from life, evidence from biology and from biochemistry that supports the idea that God created everything. And so for a long time, people have noticed that living things contain incredibly complex organs, like the eye. The eye, when you get down into the details and you look at all the parts, it is very astonishingly complex. Every bit as complex, probably more so, really, than any camera, even a digital camera, a computerized camera that you have, and especially if you include the whole visual system, because the eye would be worthless if it wasn't hooked up to a visual processing center in your brain. And once you start including that, we're leaving all human technology in the dust when it comes to the incredibly complex nature of the eye. And not only is it incredibly complex, but it's an incredibly complex structure that does something. It has a purpose. And there's good reason to believe that no incredibly complex system that does something, that has a purpose, that's complex for a reason, the complexity is functional, that nothing like that could ever arise from just natural forces and chance. And a guy who's made a really good argument for this is one of these intelligent design guys named Doug Axe. He's written a great book called Undeniable, and it's one of several books. If you're interested in learning more about this, I would recommend that you read. And there's other examples too. Of course, there's many, many examples in nature. Birds. God asked Job a question. God says, does the hawk take flight by your wisdom and spread its wings toward the south? And the point God was making, Job was wondering if God knew what he was doing. And God said, oh, Job, I am way smarter than you are. I am way wiser and more powerful than you could ever understand. He says, I'm the one who made hawks so that they can fly, and so this people, long before we had advanced modern science, people could see the evidence for design. You do not have to be a scientist to see evidence for design in living creatures. Children have this sense. They look at a butterfly and they have a feeling somebody made that beautiful butterfly. And it turns out that intuition is correct, and it is actually verified by science. So let's talk about this. I'm going to see some examples of how science verifies this intuition we have, that wonderfully complex things like a hawk flying through the air or a butterfly fluttering by, that these things must have a great, wise creator. And to do this, I'm going to focus on two things found inside all living cells. I'm going to talk about molecular machines and lots of encoded information. So all known living things are made of cells. Trees and dolphins and grass and bacteria. Some living things are just one cell, like bacteria. You and me, we have bodies, and scientists estimate that your body is made up of about 37 trillion cells. So obviously, if your body has 37 trillion cells in it, cells are very tiny. Some cells are tinier than others, but they're all very tiny. And back in Darwin's day, when he came up with his theory of evolution, scientists did not know what was inside of cells. And many scientists at that time, the common view was that cells were very simple, that they were made of some kind of protoplasmy jelly stuff or something very simple. And it turned out that they were really, really wrong, thinking that cells, just because they're tiny, thinking that they were simple. Cells are incredibly complex. It would be appropriate to compare every cell, even the simplest cell. It would be appropriate to compare the complexity to an automated car factory full of machines and computers and assembly lines and packages being moved around and everything well ordered and controlled. there's a astonishing and really astounding level of complexity inside every cell. And this includes inside every cell there are super tiny molecular machines. Now, again, I'm going to give a link to another video. This one's just 3 minutes long, and it's an animated video which explains one of these molecular machines, and it does a better job than I'll be able to do. If you want to stop and watch it, you can, or I'll put the link. I'll try to remember to put the link in the bottom in the notes. But every one of the 37 trillion cells in your body has molecular machines in it. And also, even the simplest cell, even a bacteria, has many molecular machines in it. And some of the machines in the cells in your body and in the bacteria are very similar. They may not be, they're not exactly identical, but they're very similar. One of these machines, the one that is in the video, is called ATP synthase. And there are many of these, hundreds or thousands, I think probably many thousands of these in each cell. And so you might, and not just in every cell in your body, but every cell in every flower, dolphin, ant, fish, and worm is full of molecular machines. And the ATP synthase is just one of many types of molecular machines, and not even the most complex molecular machine. Now, why is this a problem for evolution? Well, the ATP synthase works like an electric motor, and in fact, it has the parts. They look like the parts, but they actually function like the parts. It has a rotor, it has a stator, it has a shaft, and it works. It functions like an electric motor. Protons are flowing through it, causing it to spin, and this is how it's working to create ATP energy molecules that energize all of the processes in the cells, or most of the processes in the cells in your bodies. Now you can see that for this motor to work, everything has to be designed really very specially and specifically to work. All the pieces have to be the right size, they have to be the right shape, they have to be made out of appropriate material, and they have to work together to do a complex job. And not only that, but this machine appears to be irreducibly complex. That's a concept, a phrase that Michael Behe came up with. And what it means is if you take away one of the major pieces, you take away the rotor, or you take away the shaft, or you take away the stator, or you take away the casing, you won't have a ATP synthase or a motor that works a little bit. It won't work at all. It needs all of the pieces together in a very specific way to work at all. And it doesn't seem like there's any way to do that other than an intelligent designer designing the pieces and putting them together. Natural forces acting randomly. It would be like having a bunch of parts in a box, a bunch of screws and bolts and pieces of metal and maybe some shafts and wires, and just storing it and storing it and storing it. Even if you stored it for 4 billion years, it would never self-assemble into a working, functional machine. It just wouldn't. And there's no reason to think that the molecules in your cell can do this either. And so Michael Behe talks about this in this book that he wrote called Darwin's Black Box. And if you're going to start somewhere on this topic, boy, it's hard to pick because there's a lot of good books on this topic. I might pick this book to start with. It's a little bit older, but he does a really good job presenting this. He's written 2 other books since then. One of those books is called The Edge of Evolution. It's also quite good. And Darwin Devolves. And I have a blog post where I discuss, I summarize the content of all 3 books, and so I'll try to include that as well in the notes for you. Okay, so we've talked about molecular machines. Let's talk about encoded information inside living cells. So the molecular machines in the cell are built using instructions stored in the DNA molecule. So here's a very simple summary of how that works. The DNA molecule is a very, very long molecule, and it has base pairs that match up. And 3 base pairs code for an amino acid. And there's 20 different amino acids. And then depending on which 3 base pairs are next, it hooks these amino acids in chains to make a protein. And these chains can be 100, 200, 300, or even 1,000 or more long. And then because of the chemical properties and the physical properties and shapes of these amino acids, the chain folds into a shape, like it folds into something that will work as a piece as a rotor or as a stator for the ATP synthase. And they also have chemical properties that allow them to do their different jobs. So there are many thousands different types of proteins, and some of these proteins are very complex. They're like pieces of little molecular machines. And so the DNA molecule represented here in this picture, each strand is a base pair, and the base pairs, it can have 4 different chemical letters, and they've given these the symbols A, C, T, and G based on the first letter of the chemicals that they represent. And these letters work like a code. It works like a written alphabet. So imagine you had a robot that could read instructions in English in order to build a car. And so one of the instructions that your robot might be given is this: mount each tire on its lug bolts, then place the lug nut on each lug bolt and tighten each nut. Well, this is what the DNA is doing. It's giving instructions to the cell, and the cell has machines that can read these instructions, amazing machines, and can create proteins that then form together to make protein machines and other parts of the cell, and run the cell chemistry. It's really wonderful and amazing the way it all works. So just as an analogy, imagine that instead of a cell, we had a robot that wanted to make a car, and you had to give it instructions. So these instructions are like the DNA code. Now, instructions like that have to be made by an intelligent designer. If you just typed randomly for millions of years, you would never create a set of instructions like that. And we can see that that's true by asking, how hard would it be to produce just one short sentence, like the one that I just gave, of instruction by randomly typing? Or imagine alphabet soup. Imagine you had a huge bowl of alphabet soup and you stored it. Well, you randomly might get some really short words like bat or cat or to or the. It wouldn't happen as often as you think, but you would occasionally get very short words. But could you get a functional sentence which approximates the amount of information you would need for a small functional protein? And the answer is no, you could not. Now, how can we know that that's true? Well, I'm going to just do a little bit of probability with you real quick. What would be the chances of randomly typing the number 1 on a keyboard that has the 10 digits 0 through 9? And the answer, of course, is 1 in 10. Well, what would be the chances of randomly typing the number 32? Now, if it's been a while since you did probability, you might think that it's 1 in 32, or you might think that there's 2 digits, so it's 1 in 10 plus another 1 in 10. It's 1 in 20. But that's not how it works, and you can check this out and you'll find out that I'm right. That's not how it works. Instead, it's 1 in 10 times 1 in 10. So the correct answer is that you would have a 1 in 100 chance of typing 32. And if you think about it, that makes sense, because you could get anywhere from a 00 to a 99. So that's 100 possibilities, and only one of those is the number 32. So if you wanted a 3-digit number like 532, it would be 10 times 10 times 10, 1 in 1,000. Now, this sentence, which approximates on the low end the amount of information that would have to be in a string of DNA to produce one of these proteins, has 75 English letters. Now, we're going to simplify. We're not going to consider punctuation. We're not going to consider capital versus small letters, and we're not going to take spaces into account. We're going to assume that you can read it if it's all squished together, And actually, some languages, ancient Greek, biblical Greek, was written without spaces between the words. And at first, it's hard to read, but people who got used to it can read it just fine. So we're going to simplify by making those assumptions and say, what would be the chances of typing this sentence randomly? And so there's 75 letters, and for each letter, you have a 1 in 26 chance of typing it. So it would be 26 times 26 by 26 times 26 times 26, 75 times. And that comes out to be 1 in 1.3 times 10 raised to the 106th power. So that's 1 comma 3 with 100, well, because of the 3, it would be, it would be 13 with 105 zeros after it. And this is a number that's so mind-bogglingly large, we really can't understand numbers that big. We have no experience with numbers that big, except when we do these probability type of calculations mainly. For instance, you might ask how many atoms are in the observable universe. Well, nobody's counted them, of course, but scientists do have an estimation. And they estimate that there are between 1 in 10 to the 79th and 1 times 10 to the 82nd atoms in the whole known universe, not just in the planet Earth, not just in our solar system, but in all of the galaxies in the whole universe. And these numbers are much, much, much smaller than 1.3 times 10 to the 106th. They're like a billion times smaller, even smaller than that, compared to the chance of producing that sentence. So that's how hard it would be to randomly produce just one sentence 75 letters long. Now, it gets more complicated than that because you would not need that exact sentence. You could make a lot of little variations. You could think of different ways to say the same thing. But people who have studied this a lot find out that it's still, practically speaking, it is astronomically improbable. For all practical purposes, it is impossible to produce a functional sentence that long through random typing. And but life leads a lot more information than is found in one 75-letter sentence. A sentence that long might have enough information to produce one protein, but even the simplest cells need many proteins all working together. In fact, several years ago, scientists, a group of scientists modified the cell with the least amount of information. They took the cell that had the smallest amount of DNA, it's a super tiny cell, and then they tried to make it have even less DNA by cutting stuff out. They say, can the cell still live if we take this out? And can the cell still live if we take this out? And they put it in a growth medium that helped the cell to stay alive. And the cells were not very healthy when you took all that stuff out. This is a really kind of, excuse me, this kind of a disgusting example, but it would be like, can a person still live if we take off his finger, if we take one of his kidneys? What if we take the other kidney? Well, he can still live if we put him on dialysis. You know, what if we take his ear? Yeah, he can still live. He's not as healthy, but he can still live. So they did this. Of course, the cell is not a human being. It doesn't have any feelings. It doesn't know what you're doing to it. It's not cognizant. So it wasn't bad to do this to this super tiny microscopic cell, like it would be terribly evil to do it to a person. I'm just explaining what they did. And to see how small, what's the smallest amount of DNA that can make a living cell that can reproduce itself if it's in this rich growth medium with a lot of stuff keeping it alive. And so how many base pair letters are in that smallest cell? Remember, 75 in a row you couldn't get by putting them together just if they just assembled randomly in like a prebiotic soup or something. But how many did they need? And maybe somebody would guess, oh, maybe 531. Well, if somebody guessed that, they would be wildly wrong, because the actual answer is 531,000 base pairs. That's for the smallest, simplest cell. And both theoretical and experimental estimates indicate that this is about as small as it can get. Now, maybe somebody will figure out a way that it could be a little bit smaller, 529,000 or 499,000. But the point is, it is massively more, super, super massively more than can be accounted for by physical processes and random collections of molecules. It's equivalent to about 226,000 English letters in terms of how much information it has. And if someone wants to check that math, go for it. It's not too hard. It involves some exponents and logarithms. Okay, anyways. So a guy named Stephen Meyer, he's another scientist who writes about intelligent design. And he's a really smart guy. He's a philosopher of science. He studied this science a whole lot. And he wrote this book called Signature in the Cell, DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design. Again, it's not one of the newest books on this topic, but it's extremely good. And I would have a hard time picking, if I had to begin with one, whether I would pick Michael Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box, or whether I would pick this one, Signature in the Cell. They explain this stuff in a lot more detail and better than I'm able to explain it on my own in this video. Now, we asked the question, how many base pair letters are in that smallest cell? And the answer was 531,000 base pairs. But another interesting question is, how many base pair letters are in each cell in your body? Each cell in your body has the same DNA, and it has all of the DNA with all of the instructions to make all of the different types of cells in your body. Well, there may be information in addition to the information in the DNA in other parts of the cell. This is called epigenetics. But we're trying to keep it simple. And so you might wonder, well, how many, is 531,000 in that simplest cell? Maybe someone would guess, well, maybe our body has 3 million. Well, that, again, would be way too small a guess. The actual number is 3 billion. Approximately 3 billion base pairs are in the DNA in your body. I need to take a sip of water. Okay. Now, God said to Job, does the hawk take flight by your wisdom and spread its wings toward the south? Does the eagle soar at your command and build its nest on high? Again, explaining to Job how wonderful and great he is, and that we should trust him because he knows a lot more than we do. He's also proved that he's good by when Jesus died on the cross for our sins. I hope my beard rubbing against the microphone hasn't been making a lot of noise. I just realized that may have been happening some. I apologize for that. So anyways, perhaps if Job had been a 21st century molecular biologist, God would have added something like this. Did you write the DNA code for the first living cell? Did you create its amazing molecular machines? Can you, Job, or imaginary molecular biologist Job, can you design 37 trillion cells, each containing 3 billion letters of DNA code, into a body that can grow and think and see and sing and dance and believe and kneel and worship? What a great, great God we have. So I've already made some book recommendations if you want to study this stuff some more. And in addition to the books, you can look online. You can look up the Discovery Institute. There's a website called Evolution News and Views that has a lot of material about this intelligent design, this scientific evidence for God. And it's exciting to me. It feeds my soul and it strengthens my faith, and I hope it does the same thing for you. Now, the last thing I want to talk about when it comes to this science issue is the fused chromosome issue discussed by Rhett in his deconstruction story. So I don't know how much Rhett looked at this intelligent design stuff. He didn't mention the theory of intelligent design. He didn't talk about that type of evidence or why. I don't know if he even looked at it, or if he did, why it wasn't convincing to him. But he did give a piece of what he would consider, and other people might consider, to be counter evidence. And he said, and the specific piece of evidence that he discussed is something called a fused chromosome. Now, what in the world is a fused chromosome? Well, the DNA in our cells is arranged, it's collected, it's organized into different chromosomes. And we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. And scientists have noticed that some of our what they would consider from an evolutionary point of view our closest relatives, and even as someone who believes in intelligent design, I could say some of the creatures that biologically um, are the most similar to us, apes and chimpanzees and gorillas, things like that, they've noticed that they have 24 um, pairs of chromosomes. But then when they looked more closely, they saw that one of our 23 chromosomes looks like, to some scientists who looked at this, looked like it consisted of two smaller chromosomes that were put together, and the two halves are similar to two of the different chromosomes in an ape or chimpanzee or chromosome or gorilla, and uh, and when and chromosomes at the end of them, they have these things called telomeres, which are they're parts of DNA that aren't coding for proteins. They have some function in terms of helping the structure of the DNA, but they're not making proteins, and they have a recognizable code, and it looks somewhat like two telomeres maybe got stuck together, and then the chromosome in each side was similar, like I said, to the two ones in the chimpanzee or Greek, and they said this looks like the type of thing evolution would do. These two things got stuck together, and that's why we have 23 and we have 24, and they thought this is like a smoking gun for evolution, and it kind of looks like an accident in the minds of some scientists who described this. And in fact, Rhett says it would be like if you had a book and it had a photocopy of a coffee stain, and then you looked at another book that was a similar story but not the exact same story, and on the same pages it also had the same shaped coffee stain, and he says it looks like this is showing evidence that we are related to gorillas and chimpanzees. Well, I don't think that's a correct interpretation of the data from fused chromosomes. And I did a fair amount of research. I read quite a few articles on this. And first of all, it may not be a fused chromosome at all. There are some similarities to these telomeres, but what they actually see, there's also a lot that's different. And there are things called exons. They are pieces of DNA that code for proteins, and also they code sometimes for other things, the promoter regions. And this looks like it might be a promoter region with exons on both sides of the fusion that has a function. In other words, it wasn't an accident. It looks like it was designed this way, and it may not even be fused chromosomes at all. Now, if it is a fused chromosome, at the very least, it appears to be a carefully designed functional fusion, because of the fact that in the area where the fusion exists and on both sides of it, there are pieces that work together to do function in the cell. So this does not look like something that would happen by accident in nature. It looks like something that would be designed. And there's nothing to saying that God couldn't have used two of the chromosomes he used to make monkeys and put them together in a careful way on purpose to do similar things in us. I mean, we have fingers, they have fingers. It's more complicated than that. But to do something similar in us but a little bit different, and added in some extra function in the fusion area. So this would not necessarily support unguided evolution over intelligent design. Beyond that, even if there is a fused chromosome, it could have fused early in human history. In other words, maybe there were some humans very early on in human history that had 24 chromosomes, and they got fused. Sometimes this happens in copying errors, in errors in the DNA, and then that spread to the human population and became the dominant trait. And because remember, chimpanzees and gorillas do not have this fused chromosome, so it doesn't prove at all that they are related to us. That it doesn't prove common descent at all. Finally, evidence for common descent. So at most, the fused chromosome would be evidence for common descent. It would say that us and chimpanzees came from a common ancestor that had 24 chromosomes, and the chimpanzees, it did not fuse, but for us it did. Uh, but evidence for common descent is not evidence against intelligent design. Evolutionary theory has more than one major piece to it. One of the major pieces is common descent. It says that all living things are related. And for instance, your pet dog would literally be something like maybe your cousin a billionth removed or 2 billionth removed, and or maybe your trillionth cousin instead of your second cousin. But that if you trace it back far enough, you would have a common ancestor. Your great, 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 add a billion greats and add a billion greats for the dog, and you would get to some kind of a mousy looking like primitive mammal that both of you would be related to. That's evolutionary theory, common descent. And that's one piece of the theory. But as a Christian, the more important question is, did God do it, or was it done by natural forces? And evolutionary theory also posits the type of evolutionary theory that is most common in science and that's used against Christianity. They posit an all natural mechanism that depends just on random variation and the forces of nature, including natural selection. And even if there was a fused chromosome, that wouldn't say how the instructions in one half of the chromosome and the other half were originally written. It tells you nothing about that. It provides no way for that to have happened. It can explain perhaps how two pieces got stuck together, but it can't explain how the two pieces full of functional information that design cells and bodies, it's like a super, super advanced computer code, how that could have gotten there in the first place. All it says is two pieces of it got stuck together. And in fact, one of the biggest proponents of intelligent design, which we already talked about, Michael Behe, he believes, or I don't know if he still does, but I know at one point he thought that probably common descent was correct. I don't think common descent is probably correct. I think that's very unlikely. But he believes common descent is correct. But he also believes in creation. Creation, by which I mean intelligent design. Science gives evidence that there's a creator, and then from other sources of evidence, he believes that that creator is God, is the Christian God. And so evidence for common descent is not evidence against intelligent design. It is not evidence against creation at all, really. So I really feel like Rhett just and Link, that they just misunderstood that data. Or maybe they didn't look at alternative explanations enough. I'm not sure. I don't know what happened. But whatever happened is very sad because it caused them to lose their faith. By the way, I mentioned that I don't think common descent is likely. There were many problems, scientific problems with common descent. It's true that to me, the Bible, it talked about God created kinds, and I think a kind is probably like all of the dogs might be one kind, but I don't want to get into that. But scientific evidence against common descent would be things like orphan genes, and I'm not going to take a lot of time to explain that. You can look it up. It's a word play on ORF is an open reading frame. It's a part of DNA that codes for a gene or part of a gene or something like that. And what scientists thought that living creatures would have the vast majority of their genes in common, different living creatures. But they have found that many living creatures have unique genes that no other living creature has, or a group of living creatures like dogs will have genes that no other living creatures have. And I don't know if dogs is an actual example. That just popped in my mind. And they call these orphan genes. And you can go research this, and it's evidence against common descent. One of the places I read about that is another book that I recommend. Now, this is a really big book. It's called Theistic Evolution, but the subtitle is A Scientific, Philosophical, and Theological Critique. And I'll just kind of spoiler alert, it's not a positive critique. The people who wrote this book do not believe theistic evolution is correct. They believe intelligent design and God creating everything is correct. And one of the things they discuss in here is the possibility of common descent. And they point out that if common descent is true, that does not at all rule out intelligent design and creation. But they also point out that there's lots of evidence, scientific evidence, against common descent. And one of the types of scientific evidence are these orphan genes. So the molecule to man evolution story is a modern version of an ancient problem. And Paul talked about this problem in Romans chapter 1. In Romans chapter 1, Paul writes about God, for God's invisible attributes, that is, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen since the creation of the world, being understood through what he has made. In other words, we can look at the world, and we can't know everything about God. We can't know that he sent his son to be born through the Virgin Mary. We can't know that by looking at creation. But we can know that there must be a great, powerful, wise, super intelligent creator, ancient, who existed before the stars existed, being understood through what he has made. As a result, people are without excuse. People don't have a good excuse for not believing in God. For though they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or show gratitude. Instead, their thinking became worthless, and their senseless hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. Well, we've talked about the first big stone, creation and science, and this, I've already been talking for 1 hour and 21 minutes. I think that's enough for one video. So we are going to break this up into probably 2 parts, because I'm not going to talk nearly as long about the topic of hell, Rhett and Link, and many others who have deconstructed and lost their evangelical faith. They've either become non-evangelical Christians, like progressive Christians, and in some forms of progressive Christianity, really is so different, it's like a different faith. Or they've left Christianity together and they've become agnostics. Many people have gone down this path, and not just recently, also, over the last couple of 100 years, and many times over and over again, one of the issues they've mentioned is that it appears to be so terribly unjust that God would torment people forever in hell. That just seems cruel and unjust for a supposedly loving God to do. So I'm going to talk about that in part 2. I'm also going to talk about the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. That is really key, and it's one of the things to me. And then I'm going to talk about a few other things too. But I think we can probably talk about all of that in the same amount of time, or probably less time than I've talked about introducing the topic in creation and science. So I'm going to close with a little prayer. Heavenly Father, these are really big, deep topics. Where did we come from? Why are we here? And is there a God? Is there a creator? And Lord, I pray that you will guide people's hearts and minds as we think about these topics. And I pray that you will use this video to help people. And Lord, I personally don't know Rhett and Link, but if they ever watch this, I hope they will know that even though I disagree with a lot of the conclusions they came to, that I don't feel any animosity towards them. I wish that they weren't influencing other people to follow the same path. But Lord, I ask that you will forgive them and win them back to yourself. And I would be so delighted if I ever had an opportunity to get to know them and talk with them in person. Thank you, Lord Jesus. Amen.